great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Weber. Bonnie Weber is a professor at Institute for Language, Cognition and Computation in School of Informatics at University of Edinburgh. At Edinburgh, she works on discourse phenomena, collaborating on the development and use of Pan discourse tree bank. Her research areas are discourse, machine translation, and natural language semantics. She publishes on genre classification, discourse analysis, and discourse processing. She is particularly interested in discourse in the context of machine translation and the stability of language technology tools across changes in genre. And today, she will be sharing with us her valuable opinions on inferring multiple concurrent discourse relations. With that, I ask you to give your full attention to Weber. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Weber.
I guess I have full screen now, right? Yes or no? Yes, full screen. Okay, I'm going to describe some work in progress. It's a project that started about 8 months ago, and it's a project that we're hoping to continue in collaboration with colleagues at METU, so it's particularly appropriate to describe here. Let me start with some background for those of you who are not in discourse. So all I mean by discourse is something that's more than the individual sentences, but a relation between sentences and the context established by the previous discourse in terms of a reader or listener's awareness of the structure of the text, the topic, the entities it refers to, and in particular for this work, the specific semantic and rhetorical relations to elements of context, and these we call discourse relations. Now, readers or listeners infer discourse relations between a sentence and its context on the basis of world knowledge, general cognitive biases, and, most easy for a machine, linguistic features including explicit discourse connectives. Now, machines like NLP systems, natural language processing systems, generally lack any kind of deep model of context. Instead, they take the previous sentences, usually in recency order back from the current context, as a proxy for context. So when I talk about relations between sentences, that's because the previous sentences are this proxy for context, and I probably won't go beyond the need to do much more than just take the sentence per se, but it's very easy to move on to the fact that it's not previous text spans, but some inferential relations drawn from those text spans. Now, when I said that discourse connectives can be evidence for discourse relations, I want to give you 2 examples. Starting with the sentence, he suspected he shouldn't interrupt the speaker with a question. It can be followed with a discourse connective, a sentence beginning with a discourse connective, nevertheless he did. And you learn from the nevertheless that what he thought he should do is in contrast with what he actually did. If the first sentence, he suspected he shouldn't interrupt the speaker with a question, instead he should wait until the end of the talk, then you know from the use of instead that he knows waiting is a better alternative than interrupting. Now, while an explicit connective may be strong evidence for a discourse relation between the current sentence and the previous and the context, it may not be necessary for conveying the intended discourse relation. So if you had, he suspected he shouldn't interrupt the speaker with a question, he should wait until the end of the talk, you don't need instead to know that he knows that waiting is a better alternative than interrupting. On the other hand, having an explicit connective may be necessary. So if you had the same initial sentence setting up the context, he suspected he shouldn't interrupt the speaker with a question. He did. Without that nevertheless or but or an equally semantically a connective that conveys an equivalent semantics, you can't get the contrast. So they may not be necessary, but in other cases they may be. Now, what about more than one discourse relation between the current sentence and the previous context? Well, if more than one discourse is relation, you can use more than one connective. So you can say, I have to do some X because otherwise I can't do some Y. So I've got because and otherwise. I could do X or otherwise I could do Y. Again, two connectives showing that they're alternatives and that one holds if you don't do the other. I'd like to do X, but otherwise I could do Y, a contrast between not doing X, a contrast from but, and otherwise, if I don't do X, I can do Y. Now, when more than one relation is intended between a sentence and its context, we call these concurrent relations. So the title of my talk was Multiple Concurrent Relations and How We Infer Them. So the aim of the talk is to present you some concurrent relations in English, give you a sense of their variability, and then describe the crowdsourcing experiments that we're carrying out to better understand concurrent relations. Okay, let's start with the concurrent relations. In English and other languages, the usual devices for explicitly signaling discourse relations are conjunctions and discourse adverbials. So the first example there shows a conjunction, but, and the second example shows an adverbial, nevertheless. But there are other devices in every language that can serve to explicitly signal discourse relations. From an article about UFOs that was in the Wall Street Journal, even though you probably never thought that there were articles about UFOs in the Wall Street Journal. A search party soon found the unscathed aircraft. This aircraft disappeared from radar. They found the unscathed aircraft in a forest clearing, much too small to have allowed a conventional landing. What's more, the 7 male personnel aboard were missing. Okay, what's more conveys the discourse relation that this is even more surprising. And the construction, this was because, analyst says, this was because hefty fare increases early in the year scared off many leisure travelers. So even though there are other devices that can explicitly signal discourse relations, I'm going to focus here on conjunctions and adverbials because that's what we're doing in our crowdsourcing experiments. Okay. What's the difference between conjunctions and adverbials? Because so far they've looked pretty much alike. Well, in English at least, the discourse conjunctions appear only at the start of a clause, while discourse adverbials can appear there or elsewhere. So we had but and nevertheless, as in 11 and 12, I've shown you already, and they didn't look any different, but nevertheless can also occur after an auxiliary or after the first NP. So there are nevertheless limits, and these adverbials can also appear with conjunctions somewhere. So, but there are nevertheless limits. But nevertheless, there are limits. The other is that discourse conjunctions generally link a clause to its immediate discourse context, what's immediately been said, previously been said, while discourse adverbials can link elsewhere. So in this one example here, which has two, a conjunction so and an adverbial instead, the so says that if you raise one side of a slab, you get an awkward 5-inch slant. So instead, make the drive higher at the center instead of at one edge. And the instead is instead of raising one side of the form. So we have a conjunction and an adverbial, and they're able to link the clause to its immediate context, but nevertheless they can pick up different things. Sometimes they pick up the same thing, sometimes they pick up something different. In both cases, they're making two separate relations. I shouldn't say in all cases, but in this case, they also have two separate relations. Now, the motivation for the work is to better understand these concurrent discourse relations and their patterns of occurrence, either as the pair of conjunction plus adverbial or just bare adverbials which have an inferred conjunction. And we want to do this in as theory-neutral a way as possible, so we do this on the basis of corpus analysis and on the basis of some crowdsourcing experiments where we get the results, we get judgments from a large number of people and then try to interpret the results. Now, the reason this is valuable, well, from a computational perspective, it's valuable because if in language technology we're going to try to extract different kinds of relations from a text, you have to be aware that there may be more than one in a given place. But it's also relevant for psycholinguistic theories of understanding of discourse, and clearly in corpus annotation itself. So, how to assess the concurrent relations? We've done three things in this assessment. We've looked at Google Ngrams to characterize discourse adverbials and their frequency. Then we've looked also using the Google Ngrams to look at the frequency of adverbials along with conjunction, and this gives us a sense of the possibility of the same adverbial with different conjunctions. Okay, so I don't expect you to read the horizontal axis, but this is a plot of 80 different adverbials in English and their counts in Google Ngrams, and it's not the raw counts because we've wanted to identify those adverbials when they're used as discourse connectives. So we've only looked for them in clause initial position, in if they can occur in some kind of phrase which is not discourse connective, then we've also tried to exclude those kinds of examples using punctuation. But this gives you a rough sense that we've got another Zipfian distribution as it happens in every other aspect of language. The adverb then occurs most frequently, then however, overall, thereafter. And then there's this long tail. We have 80 plotted here, but there are clearly many, many more discourse adverbials. Now, the Google Ngrams shows that all discourse adverbials occur most frequently as bare adverbs. They don't occur adjacent with a conjunction adjacent to them. But when they do have a conjunction immediately to their left, nothing separating the conjunction and the adverbial, some adverbials show a preference for certain conjunctions. So the adverbial therefore, when it's preceded by a conjunction, is almost always preceded by and slightly by so. And the adverbial nevertheless, when it's preceded by a conjunction, is most often preceded by but nevertheless, sometimes by and nevertheless, and sometimes by so nevertheless. And you can see similar patterns for otherwise, which most often co-occurs with or. For example, which surprisingly most often co-occurs with so, if it has any conjunction before it. So, for example, but we also get and, for example, because, for example, but, for example, and or, for example. Other adverbials show a much more even distribution according to the Google Ngrams. So with after all, we find almost equal number of and after all, because after all, but after all. Similarly with first of all, instead. With the Google Ngrams, we didn't find many because instead, but you can find them in corpora and in general. So you can see that we're getting different patterns with different adverbials. So all adverbials are not the same when it comes to their co-occurrences with conjunctions. Well, what about bare adverbials? Do bare adverbials ever appear with concurrent relations, meaning there's also this sense as a conjunction as well? I've given you one example before, but now I'm going to give you lots more because they're the basis for an initial experiment and then our crowdsourcing. So the kinds of examples are shown in blue here. Mentioning the word sex on daytime television was taboo at the time, she recalled. And what we would present to people with a blank prior to the adverb, and then the rest of the sentence. And we asked people to say what conjunction they could put there. The initial work on this was done by a master's student, Shi Jiang, in 2013. She ran a small crowdsourcing experiment on 4 adverbials. So when she found explicit cases of the adverbial following a conjunction, she would keep that example unless it was totally incomprehensible or involved something that we shouldn't show around too much, because a lot of these things we got them off the web, we got them off magazines, and a lot of them for some reason involve pornography. So we had to exclude all of those, and I don't know if there's a machine program that can eliminate the pornography, so we had to do that by hand. So she did this small crowdsourcing experiment on the 4 adverbials. She got 20 passages per adverbial, and in her experiment, each adverbial was preceded by a blank. Of those 20 passages, 10 were in the original preceded by a conjunction, and I'll call those explicits, and the other 10 appeared in the original without a conjunction, and we'll call those implicits. And she showed each passage to 52 judges, and they were asked to select which of 7 conjunctions or no conjunction would best fill in the blank. And it's here that we started seeing different patterns for the 4 adverbials. So I'll just give you a sense of this. When we had an original sentence which had because after all, and remove the because, most subjects selected because, and the ones those are shown over here, these last 4 tokens. So this is cumulative over all the judgments of all 52 judgments of all sentences which had originally because after all, and the because was removed. So there were 4 of those which originally, they had 5 which had originally because after all. And those are over these, the last 5 here. If the original had but after all or and after all, there was a much lower frequency of choosing because. So the blue is because, and this shows the proportion of people selecting because. And you can see that it's lower than the proportion of people selecting because when the original was because. Now, when there wasn't any explicit conjunction in the original text, and we just had blank after all, in almost all of those cases, over 60% of the trials, 52 people times 10 trials, they tended to choose because. I mean, they chose other things, but almost always they tended to choose because. So what Jiang's experiment showed us, that even without an explicit conjunction, we can get 2 relational senses conveyed between the second sentence and the first one. And so whether there was originally a conjunction or not, we would get patterns of conjunction sense and a adverbial sense, and we can see already that different adverbials have different patterns, and we wanted to understand the pattern in order to make correct predictions. Okay, so that led us to write a proposal to the Nuance Foundation, which we started in this past August. So I'm reporting on work that's been going on for the past 8 months. It's a small grant just for 2 years. And our first aim is to establish what adverbials can co-occur with conjunctions, and then to identify which conjunctions, if any, the adverbials favor, because they may favor none of them. And our third aim is to determine whether, when they appear with conjunctions, when people favor conjunction, it leads to a sense of more than one concurrent relation, or whether there are other interactions between the conjunction and the adverbial that we haven't thought of. Okay, so since August, besides the looking at Google Ngrams, we've been carrying out 3 studies. We initially carried out a replication study, which was done to correct 2 aspects of Shijiang's methodology. One is that she had none as an option, and we wanted to distinguish between none meaning none of the conjunctions that you've shown me, and none mean don't put a conjunction because I don't like it at all. And the second aspect of Jiang's methodology that we wanted to correct was she didn't try to pick tokens of the adverbials that would have a sense which was different from the other. So it could be that she got results of people mainly picking because in the bare after all cases, because underlying all of them was an implicit because. And since we know after all can occur with other conjunctions, we tried to do our best when we had implicit adverbials, ones where the conjunction was not there and might be implicit, we tried to get a variety. So that actually took a time. So that's the replication study, and I'll show you a little bit about that. Then we did a pre-test to get the final bugs out of the interface, and unless you're a psycholinguist, you won't believe how much work is needed to get the bugs out of the interface, and different ways that people can misinterpret you. And then finally, a week ago Friday, we mounted the experimental data on the Amazon Mechanical Turk, and within 3 hours we had all our data. So after 8 months, we were able to get our data in 3 hours. It just boggled my mind. Okay, let's start with the replication study. This was our initial interface. The project is called Context, and we would show people examples with a blank before a double slash and a blank before the adverbial. And we asked the subject, in this case it was 3 of the people on the grant, because we were just mainly trying to choose our examples and make sure that they were understandable and they didn't all have the same sense. So we could choose to veto or choose something, and we could write comments for each other. Okay, I shouldn't hit submit. In the replication study, we learned something. We assessed, as Jiang did, overall agreement with the author per adverbial. So all of the tokens and all of the judgments for a given adverbial were pooled together. And what we found is that often the judges and the author chose the same one conjunction. So here are cases where the author had and followed by specifically, and the judges, when they saw specifically, chose and to the same extent. Almost to the same extent when the author had but nevertheless. So the light blue is the author, the number of times the author had this in the tokens, and the dark blue is the judges, and the judges actually had more tokens which they said but goes with this nevertheless, so it included some of the cases where the author had and nevertheless. Sometimes with the same conjunction and adverbial pair, but in different contexts, the judges and the authors chose the same conjunction, but they chose different ones for different passages. So if the original was and in general, fewer of the judges chose and. If the original was because in general, more of the judges chose because. If it was but in general, it was about equal. If there was or in general, there were fewer judgments thinking it was or. And with so, it was about equal and maybe a few more judgments for so. And sometimes the judges' preferences differed strongly from the authors. So here we have cases where the author used here cases where the author used or. This is or in other words. The author used so in other words. And in the case of or, fewer judges chose or. They chose and or because. Or they chose so. So there were many more judgments for so, in other words, than the authors had originally put. So clearly some of these ors are becoming so. Okay, the judges can also disagree among themselves. So this was an example in which the original had because, and we have three judges, one of whom said because, one of whom said so, and one of whom said and. So we didn't try to analyze all of these results, but we wanted to make sure that if we as judges disagreed, then we should try them out on the workers when we get around to doing the actual experiment. Now with the implicits, now remember with Xi's experiments, with Jiang's experiments, almost all of them, the judges chose a single conjunction for a bare adverbial. Here we had nothing, got nothing from the author, so all we could do was compare what the judges said. And the judges agreed with each other, so anywhere from 64% of the time to about 90% of the time. So here in all of these, the original will have no conjunction, and here because was the unanimous choice among the three judges. We wanted a New York tone because after all, this is New York. And then in the next case, before after all, so both of these have after all of the judges said but. Okay, an otter in a hotel lobby does seem extreme, but after all, Aspen is the ultimate pet town. Okay, so we have the adverbial after all, and in these two cases, the judges were very strong in selecting a particular adverbial, but it was different. It wasn't always the same one, as in Xi's case, where she got almost always the same one. Let's see. This now seems to have stopped working. Okay, now, so that's not working, so let's escape and go forward. Let's see, okay, I'll go forward this way, and then I'll get back to this screen. Let's see, and try again. Now here's a case in which there was nothing in the original, and the three judges chose three different conjunctions. Two of them chose. One says you shouldn't have any conjunction there. Okay. Oops. Wait a second. That just went back. Something is going wrong here. Let me get out of this. Go forward. 1, 2. Okay. Now, one of the things can you read that even if I don't expand it? Okay. One of the things we learned from this replication study is that the judges are going to vary in what they choose. And one thing we learned is that the judgment might reflect a stylistic preference rather than what the sense is. I'll tell you, a lot of them sound a lot better without any conjunctions. It's much punchier. So we had to change the instructions to force the workers to make a choice. That's what it says here. You must make a choice even if the insertion leads to an awkward or lengthy sentence, as long as you think the word brings out the meaning that links the two spans. So we're trying to force the judges to overcome their stylistic preferences and tell us what the sense is, without asking them explicitly for sense, because we didn't think that untrained judges could explicitly label sense. Now, it's been said before that conjunctions vary in specificity. So this was part of the conclusion in Ali Knott's PhD thesis from 1998. So sounds more specific, is used more in more specific contexts than and. So when you have so, you can use and, but when you have and, you can't always use so. So is more specific than and. We also found that some adverbials are idiosyncratic in their use. You don't want to say that they convey the same thing, but in certain cases, they can be used interchangeably. So it turns out that or otherwise seems to be interchangeable with because otherwise. You've got to be nice to them, otherwise they're not going to be nice to you. And when asked to fill in the blank, the author originally had or otherwise, the judges invariably put because. And it's not that they have a different meaning, it's just that they're both interchangeable, and it's not always the case that or and because mean the same thing. Okay, we're not using those, we're using this, okay? It's also the case that the author and the judges may differ how they interpret a passage. So here we found the author used but, and two of the judges inserted because, felt because was conveying the relation, and one said it was but. Some of the plan, it's true, is in business speak. After all, he's a businessman. And the author said, but after all, he's a businessman. But for two of the judges, some of the plan, it's true, is in business speak because after all, he's a businessman. I challenge you to say that one is correct and the other isn't. So there may be more than one way to interpret a passage so that alternative conjunctions are appropriate. Oh, okay, damn. Okay, let me get back to here. Okay, in the pretest that we ran on 9 subjects, we ended up revising the interface so that it was cleaner and clearer. This is the first screen that they see. When they hit first example, the screen opens up to show them the first example. This shows them in one of their trials. They are asked if they want to see instructions again, they can hit show instructions. Otherwise, they just fill in one of the conjunctions, and as soon as they fill in one of the conjunctions and hit submit, they get this question about whether it sounds okay. So this is our second way of trying to get the judges or the workers to overcome their stylistic preferences and put the meaning in. So here, the person said, I could say it this way. Now, the pre-trial is our way. This is the third experiment, the one that just finished on a week ago Friday. We want to get 40 people to do a lot of these trials, and I mean a lot. I mean 1,000. So we tried getting 75 people to see who was really good at this. We used Amazon's Mechanical Turk. We enrolled 75 workers. It was would take them about a half an hour. We paid them $8, and we were very quickly enrolled people. We used what are called catch trials to eliminate people making random choices. So these catch trials are things where it's obvious what you should be putting in, and if you put in anything other than the obvious, then you're not paying attention. The goal also of the pretrial, but we haven't done it yet, is to see whether Dirk Hovey's system called MACE can do an equally good or better job than these catch trials, because it means we wouldn't have to add extra catch trials to catch whether people are doing it. This is from a paper from 2013, Learning Who to Trust with MACE. And we also propose using some software developed by Becky Passanow and Bob Carpenter to identify which workers may be biased in their choice of what conjunction they select. And this is important so that you know how to combine the results. It's not that you're trying to eliminate bias, because everybody has some kind of interpretive bias, but you want to know what's the difference between a wrong answer and somebody who just tends to answer in a particular way. Okay, since this only completed last Friday, we don't have many results yet, but I can say that in about 7% of the trials, and we had 78 workers who started and 71 workers who completed the trials, there were 243 cases where the workers said that it sounded weird and they wouldn't say this, but a quarter of those trials came from 3 workers, and since we're trying to eliminate people from the original 70 down to 40, I think we're just going to drop those people. Now, interesting was the fact that while 20 of the passages were originally bare adverbials, and the 20 passages, given the number of people who number of workers who filled in a result, led to 1,432 trials, the answer none, meaning no conjunction would work here, was never the majority choice. And remember, none meant no explicit conjunction could convey the sense derived, that the worker derived for the example. They chose none for only 6 of the passages, and half of those 42 trials, 6 were for 2 particular passages. And remember, even for these, none is not the majority. So the 2 passages, both were examples of after all, and we had a quarter, was it a quarter of the judgments or half the judgments? Half the judgments half the judgments of none were for these 2 examples. They didn't want to put anything here, but the majority majority of the workers chose because as best expressing the connection. Okay, so that's it. The conclusions that I'd like you to come to from this is that we shouldn't assume at most one discourse relation between a pair of clauses, or a clause and its context, or a sentence and its context. Discourse adverbials are not always bare. We have things like but after all, but otherwise, so instead. But they differ in how the adverbials combine with conjunctions and how the sentences containing bare adverbials are interpreted. Now, while the corpus study could tell us how to identify explicit patterns of conjunction and adverbials, it's not going to help us with patterns of bare adverbials and the conjunctions that go with the sense that people infer. And for that, we're using crowdsourcing experiments to gather data in English. And that's where we bring in our colleagues at METU and hope that joint work with Denise and her group will deliver similar insights in Turkish, and Denise can explain a lot better than I can why Turkish is so appropriate for this, such that she had noticed the existence of these multiple connectives even before we had started our study. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to some ongoing work that I hope we have some interesting results for in the near future. Thank you.
Hi. So I was thinking about an example similar to the one that you gave in the beginning. This is going to be a little bit out of context. But have you seen any cases where so you have seen cases where arg1s are different? Sorry for using this terminology. But have you seen any examples where arg2s were different for these concurrent connectives?
I don't think I understand what you mean by arg2 being different.
Yes, so there was this example, and instead, or
Yeah.
so instead.
Yeah.
So there, so the one of the connectives was
So was it-
connecting. What was the example? I can't remember.
Well, I'm going to put up some examples.
Okay.
So, I mean, here with because, otherwise, or otherwise, but otherwise, I don't think I could have the exact same text following all three cases. So we're not making any assumptions that are true, except for the fact that when people draw different inferences about the relation between arg1 and arg2, arg2 is always going to be the same. So the example I showed you where some...
It was before, I think. It was in the beginning.
Oh, well, this is the one I wanted to show you
I see.
was... well, in this example, this wasn't the one where they... oh, yeah. This was the example. This was the example where arg2 is always, after all, he's a businessman, and there are two different possible relations between them. One is explaining why why the plan is in business speak, and the other is saying that you shouldn't be surprised at the contrast between business speak and the conclusion because, but after all, he's a businessman, so you should expect that. So it's not unexpected. So the but is showing a contrast between expectation, what's expected and what's not. So there, arg2 is the same, but in most cases, the second sentence, the one that has the adverbial, is different. All of them are different. Or maybe I haven't understood you, and we should talk more.
Yeah, there was a slide towards the beginning, I think, maybe back. So the example was so instead, I think, and so was connecting a bigger part.
Yes. Okay. Right.
Okay.
I know what example you're talking about. Let me see if I can get it. It's the one about the building the... This one is the one. So here, the so and the instead differ in terms of what they take as what they're connecting. Yes. And I think you would say that so has as its argument instead make the drive higher at the center, whereas instead has as its argument make the drive higher at the center. So I don't think the argument to instead needs to include the so, but the conventions of the Penn discourse tree bank, you would include it because you can't just drop a piece of a sentence which isn't a clause.
Okay, so if it were the case that we have some discontinuous, we allow discontinuity.
We allow discontinuous.
In Turkish, yeah.
Yeah,
so,
we allow discontinuous arguments.
Okay, so we allow non-adjacent ones as well in arg2 in very specific domains, I think, in very specific examples.
Yeah,
so,
I think you need both. I think you definitely need
so
both.
they are already different. So there was, can I?
Mine is rather a methodological question. I've been thinking why you had choices with conjunctions rather than with no conjunctions, even if you had non-conjunctions in most of the cases. Could it be the fact that you provided several alternatives in your among your responses and forced the participants to choose one out of those responses?
Sorry, we also allowed people to choose other and just insert whatever connective they wanted. So we explicitly allowed we corrected this error in Zheng's methodology, saying none could either mean none of these versus none at all. So none at all was none, and none of these was other. So if the person chose other, they could put in whatever they wanted.
I see. So I actually was thinking whether providing a lot of choices at once might have prevented your participants from choosing none as no conjunctions, because there might be a tendency to select one among the, and this is also true for reflecting the multiple discourse, multiple interpretations and multiple possibilities. So when you have more chances and more possibilities, there might be a tendency to choose only one out of them, where even if there are more possibilities. And I'm just wondering if just rating study, like giving the sentence with no conjunction and asking participants to rate how plausible or acceptable this one sentence might solve this issue that I'm bringing up. So,
So we didn't test the hypothesis that giving too many choices would prevent people from saying none. We had pre-tested every single trial with the local judges and did not include anything where the local judges all chose none. So the local judges weren't prevented. But it is the case that it's possible that something is keeping people from saying none, other than the example itself. And I guess I'm going to have to say, I don't care. Because if they say something is conveying the sense, I don't care if they would prefer none stylistically. There's a lot of them that I prefer none stylistically and had to, was forced to choose because it sounds awkward. It really does. On the other hand, that doesn't mean the sense is not being conveyed. So we really need a way of getting people to choose and say, even if I've chosen, I'd prefer not saying it this way. I would say it without. So we always allowed people to indicate they're being forced to make a decision. And they took advantage of that, of saying, I don't like this. So there were some trials in the 40 separate passages where no one ever said they were unhappy with the sense of the sound of a conjunction, and some of them where people were unhappy. So I don't mind. I don't mind that they don't choose none, even if they would want to, because I don't think people understand why they would choose none. I really don't.